really thank you very much for coming up to do this for us. It's a real honor to have both of you, two people I've really admired for many years, and to have them both on a panel is a real privilege for me. So let me start by going back to the history we were discussing, because I think it's a useful. So let me start with Madhav. So why did you want to talk to us? What made you, why did you do what you did? You didn't, I don't think anybody knew about us, so what made you want to talk to us? Why did you tolerate us? I'm still a bit baffled by the amount of kind of success we've had. And I always go back to thinking, why did any of them want to talk to us, and you in particular?
Actually, I think I was curious first. You were already working with Seva Mandir,
yeah,
and you had some kind of a workshop in Udaipur,
yeah,
for which we sent a new recruit. We didn't want to spare anybody important. So Mitesh Thakkar, who was a Harvard education graduate and all that, we said, okay, go find out what's happening. No, it was a little better than that. And Mitesh came back and said, this is what they are doing and this is what they are going to do. And I think I was curious about it. Now, I don't remember every detail of how exactly that happened, but there was an internal discussion. Should we get involved in this at all? I mean, who are these guys? What do they think? How can they evaluate us? We are cat's whiskers and all that. So, but I think when we met, I was curious about what you were saying. I don't know at what point you brought it up. I think it was much later, when the Baroda study, the Mumbai and Baroda study was finalized, more or less. You told me, you looked me in the eye and said, do you know what this means? That when we actually do the evaluation, you lose control of your organization. That was a scary moment. And saying, what is this guy going to do with my organization now? But I think it also helped that I had some science background and I wasn't too worried about, things. The worry would have been, what if, we are making all these claims that our programs work and somehow the results show that nothing is working, then there's a trouble. But I don't think I wasn't that worried. I think many of the colleagues later on were very comfortable with that. That's not a problem. If we are not doing well, then we should know. And we should know what we can do better. So partly your reputation, partly our own backgrounds, with Rukmini and me specifically coming from research background of a serious kind, I think both things helped.
I mean, that was a bit of a vain question. I'll admit, I did want to know, but there's a certain degree of vanity in asking that question. Mr. Krishnan, I'm going to ask you the same question. Which is, why did you decide to partner with Jayapal? I hate putting you on a spot.
No, I think the answer to that one is not too difficult. I think 2-3 reasons. One is, of course, there was this conversation I had with Iqbal once in Washington sometime in 2010, where he came to meet me. I was then working there, so he came and told me about Jayapal and the organization he'd just joined. And Iqbal is a person I admire for a different reason altogether, but I mean, that he could throw up being in the civil service, having come out at the top of that particular heap and go and do whatever he was doing. And so I said, okay, there must be some meaning to what they're doing if Iqbal is there and doing all of this. But then when I came back to India, and that was at the end of 2010, and first 2 years or so, 2.5 years, I was doing other jobs. And I went to the planning department sometime in the middle of 2012. And the planning department, is an advisory department. You don't take very many decisions. You're not a very important guy in the overall scheme of things. And probably in a sense, it was my own Tom Sawyer moment, the famous story in Tom Sawyer, the anecdote of him painting the fence and then making it very attractive for everyone else to want to do it. So it became a bit like that in terms of wanting to do things with the planning department which would work. And we had two parts to the planning department, the Department of Evaluation and Applied Research and the Department of Economics and Statistics, which were well suited to do things for government and well suited to have a role with providing evidence on which policy required to be based. And somehow the rest of government wasn't really taking them very seriously. So here was an opportunity to try and see if we could change some of that and bring in another entity which could help with that. And that's when I think I got back in touch with Iqbal and spoke with him. And then this entire team came out and the relationship just built, and we structured it as we went along. There's always, for us, 2 or 3 things were important. One, that the system needed to own it up. It can't be one person wanting to push something, but we needed everybody in the system to own it up. We needed political buy-in, so we actually made it an announcement by the Chief Minister in the Assembly, which sort of, they felt there was this big thing which was happening, which is good. I mean, sometimes they tell you in the beginning saying we didn't know what we were announcing, but it sort of then later on makes a difference in terms of the dividends that it yields in various ways. And of course, there was a big piece on capacity building because that was something we were keen on right from the beginning. So all of that sort of brought us into that particular relationship. And most importantly, one big challenge we were consistently facing is there were newer programs. It was not possible to do very much in terms of new programs because the total budgets are so tied up. The extra money available is so limited. So unless you change things around, tweak things around within programs, it was always going to be difficult. So this was a way of trying to do that and make a meaningful difference.
Well, thank you. Let me pursue with you, Mr. Krishnan, a little bit further. I feel that one implicit in what you said, but maybe you can give us a slightly broader view of that, which is, this, I think implicitly you're describing something about the role of evidence, a relation of evidence with the political process. And you observe this from many angles, including through this process, but obviously before and after that. And so tell us a little bit maybe about how you think about that, because it's sort of core to our mission is to understand what are the constraints in using evidence, how does someone inside government think about evidence, what strategies you take to make evidence usable within government?
One of the things, and I don't know if it's true of other states and governments, but it's certainly true of Tamil Nadu, is that people want to make a particular decision right at the top for various reasons, but they want people down below to give them reasons why it should be made the way it is. So the first thing you ask is, give me a proposal. If the secretary or the minister wants to take a decision, he asks the people down below to give him a proposal as to why something should be done. I was exposed to this many years ago, almost 20 years ago when I was a district collector. I just happened to be wandering through the district. We had a fairly wet monsoon and we had a lot of goats and sheep which seemed to be not doing too well. And I was talking to our animal husbandry people about this and figuring out what the problem was, and people were telling me goats are dying because of something called the blue tongue disease. And we have something called a cattle mortality register which had to be maintained in each village. So we put out an instruction saying, please maintain the cattle mortality register, let's register the number of goats which are dying and so on. This happens through the week. And over the weekend, suddenly, seat of the pants decision from Chennai, from our district headquarters, from our state headquarters, which says that any goat which dies, we'll pay 300 rupees. And I was Monday mornings usually are grievance days in Tamil Nadu for the collectors. And I was sitting in the grievance day and I was just flooded with some 500, 600 applications saying I lost 20 goats, I lost 30 goats, I lost 40 goats, and no means of verifying whether it had actually happened or not. And that is something which sort of embedded this idea that if you make decisions on the spur of the moment, on the run, and you're going to have a serious problem. Because finally what they did was they gave us 1 crore rupees and said, do what you can, but we're not giving you any more money, just distribute this to whoever comes up, and which is a completely arbitrary way of doing it. If you say that I'm going to give money for every goat, you better give money for every goat, but leaving us holding the can, literally saying, here's 1 crore and I have to satisfy so many people. I think that experience taught me that as much as possible in government, we need to have mechanisms which keeps data ready to take decent decisions. And very often there are many decisions which get made on the fly, which get made on, because somebody has intuitively an understanding or wants to do it in a particular way without adequate evidence. And that's why I think evidence-based policy making, data-based decisions are absolutely crucial. Ultimately, you're dealing with public money, you're dealing with taxpayers' money. You have to exercise due care and diligence. And that, in a sense, was one of the reasons why I felt whenever we function, we have to build systems which would give us the necessary data.
As an aside, that reminds me of Nachiket Moore once told me a story about this very clever idea he had for cattle insurance. So again, the cattle were dying and he had to somehow pay for it, but the problem was, how do you know the cattle had died? So he said, well, I think their brilliant idea was, bring us the ear of the cow. And then, of course, immediately there was a whole market in ears of cow. People started trading in the ears of cows as a result of that. If you needed an ear of a cow, you always could get one on the market and claim it. So he said that this taught him a lesson about the ingenuity of the Indian marketplace. Madhav, I want to ask you the same question from the opposite side. Through Asar, Pratham has been very conscious of the role of evidence in governance. Same question, in a sense, from the other side. Evidence inside government, evidence outside government. And Pratham has been the leader in that, in a sense, in making kind of public use of data. In India, certainly, this is by far the most impressive and credible exercise that's been done. So, how do you think about the relationship between governance and evidence?
How do you do the relationship? What?
Between governance and evidence. So, the role of Asar, to take an example, is something that's intended to feed back on the governance process, I assume.
I think with the governance, the problem with governance is there is also elected representatives. So, and rational and irrational decisions. So the role of evidence is very difficult. Once you're elected, maybe to a limited extent you start looking at evidence and say, this is what I want to implement. But I think, like the example of the goats dying, I think there is going to be that pressure from demands which are not evidence-based or policy demands or whatever. That is going to happen. But to keep the sanity in governance, I think it is important to have evidence generated. I think by and large, a large piece of information that reaches the policymakers should be evidence-based, so at least some rationality prevails and people don't make decisions just on the spur of the moment, like how many students to pass. Apparently the other day, somebody was telling me that in a major state where there was all sorts of chaos, the government had already decided that this time for the 10th standard examination, 50% students will pass. So once you decide that, then the scales are already decided. This is how many students will pass. That has nothing to do with actually how many pass, how many fail. I don't know who decided on the TET examination, the teacher eligibility test. And only 6% are passing, I believe, wherever you go. I don't know how these things were decided. Nobody actually demanded that you need a teacher eligibility test. This is something that the government itself had decided. So it is in these cases where the government is deciding things on its own that you probably want to test and check what the evidence is going to be like. So there will be pressure from the general public and the electorate saying that we want so many % reservation and so on. Those are the political sides of decision making. But there could be others, there are definitely many other issues which are not necessarily something that the electorate goes for, like the effectiveness of school education, effectiveness of health initiatives. All these things are not yet a matter of public demand.
So you think Asar has not succeeded in making it? I mean, I thought that's the point of Asar.
To make what?
To make the public more sensitize the public to what they are getting for their education rupee and therefore change the nature of the political conversation on that.
It was not actually the purpose of Asar. It's interesting how Asar evolved, if you know. I'm sure you do. But Asar, the idea of Asar came from the government itself. Because Dr. Manmohan Singh and Chidambaram and everybody was talking about emphasizing outcomes over outlays. That was their language from almost the day they got elected in 2004. And our response was to say that, okay, since you are now imposing a 2% education cess, at that time it was 2%, why don't you come out and tell people what impact it has? That is the origin of the word Asar. And they did not think they were going to be able to do that. And so we said, why can't we do it? As citizens, we do it. And we would, definitely we thought that we could present evidence of whether it was working or not working, and then the government could do different things. It was not as though we were out there to inform the general public about it at that point. I mean, some people did ask, I mean, are you trying to put negative pressure on the government and so on? And that was not our intent. But eventually what happened, and it has happened over the years, after the first 2 or 3 years. First 2 or 3 years, I think I remember that we used to release the data, report, and the newspapers would report it around that day. But since the last several years now, we see that Asar has become something that a lot of people quote, and not necessarily seasonally, not only in the Asar season of January, February. Anytime people write about education, and it has become a piece of general evidence that education is not good. Earlier, people used to say that government schools are not good in quality. But what does that mean? Now people routinely say children can't read, children don't know mathematics, children don't know this. But that has not gone down to the village yet. I think that is one of our failures. And we have not done it systematically or even deliberately to go to the village and say, now you must demand. That is not something that Pratham has done. Pratham has gone the other way and said that, okay, here's the evidence that, okay, your children can't read, and within X number of days, all these children will be able to read. We've gone that way, so-called constructively, if you will. But maybe we should have gone the other way, and maybe we should go the other way and say, here's the problem, and how are you going to fix it? A little aggressively. I don't know whether we would or
It's
not.
a bit maybe aggressive of me to actually tell you something about Pratham. It seems a bit presumptuous, but in fact, that's what you said is not true. Rukmini and I were involved in a RCT in Jaunpur, where we did go to the village, and we told them exactly, how bad, we told them how bad their teaching results were, B, we told them how to test their own children and find out how bad it was, and that had no impact on anything, if you remember.
I would disagree. There was a limit on what you did in Jaunpur. You gave the information and stopped short.
No, we told them the name of the education person in the block, etc., etc.
I disagree. You see, there is giving information, and then the comparison is to say, okay, here's a volunteer who is willing to teach, and then you see an impact. You didn't launch an agitation against poor quality. Then I would say, if there was an agitation launched and said, this is how you do an agitation, it would be different. I remember in Rajasthan, some blocks, the villagers locked up the schools and said, don't come, don't bother, because the school is not working. I mean, if somebody actually launched an agitation, that would be a different one. So we've gone 1, 2, but not the third step. Of course, then, but even giving the data, ASAR data, Tamil Nadu threw us out practically. So.
On that friendly note, coming back to you, Mr. Krishnan, I want to push a little bit the same line because it interests me, which is how is it that, you know, suppose some of these evaluations that you are sponsoring generate kind of just descriptive data, for example, which suggests that the government programs are not working. How does one feed that back into the government system? I mean, people often say, I was being interviewed today by somebody who said, governments don't want to get bad news, so why is it that you bother? I mean, there was this, he was an Australian, and that was the drift of his question. So
that's always a challenge. I mean, forget about getting a study done in this fashion, and it's a risk. It's, I think, a well-considered risk. If you look at our data protection policy, it's very carefully designed to sort of mitigate some of those risks and, you know, gives us chances to sort of rebut some elements and so on. So I think Aparna and I sat down many times. We discussed it many times before we finalized it because we realized what JPAL and the researchers were interested in is research work which would eventually get published. Government ideally would like to see good reports which say nice things. And if it doesn't say good enough things, then at least a chance to kind of figure out where things have gone wrong and look at those issues. It's not that, you know, you want to silence something which is being said, but it's just that you want it to be disseminated in a way that where you get a chance to respond or chance to put forward your part of the story. So that's the way that was structured. I mean, that's one of the things that we took care of in the sense of what needed to happen. The problem again is it's also a question of the kind of media attention that you get. I mean, 20 years ago, I used to be a budget officer in Tamil Nadu. We would routinely place the CNAG's report in the assembly. Nobody would even read it. I mean, it would run into reams. Now, every time there's a CNAG's report, they would pick up and, you know, everyone knows that it makes news. And so they pick out the bits, the so-called juicy bits, which nowadays they sort of put into convenient boxes and do all the decorations so that it gets picked up easily. So a lot of, you know, I mean, there is a lot of market for the bad news about what's happening in the government system. And that is a risk that you face. And I think the better way to face the risk is that if we did these studies and we got about, say, 60, 70% good news, which gets built up, that would also get some sort of buy-in and purchase. I think rather than shut it all down, it's better to try and generate as much of it as possible so that some of it is positive, some of it works, and the spin industry can thereafter take it over and see how they can spin it. So I would, you know, I think rather than it's a different approach to the same problem, saying, yes, I have been asked, my chief secretary did ask me, saying, why are you doing all this? And then suppose they write a report which is critical and all of us are in soup. So you have to respond to those by saying, look, there's a possibility that we would get some good answers. We are not designing the study fundamentally to find out what didn't work. We are trying to design a study to find out what would work better. So why don't we look at it from that perspective was the way we approach this whole question.
Let me just continuing a little bit on that. I mean, if you had to think forward towards, I mean, I think you bring up exactly, I think, a key issue, which is media. I think media is absolute, you know, it loves kind of things you can describe in one line. And the education has improved a little bit is not news. 70% of children can't read in school is news. So how do you propose we deal with that? I mean, it's a shared problem of the government, Pratham, and us. We're all kind of in the business of making small improvements and hoping that that's good enough. And the rest of the world loves to think of, small improvements is just not interesting enough. You want big disasters are better news than small improvements. So how does one deal with the landscape? It's completely crucial for all of us, I think.
I think for government, there's so much going on that, there are various other people in the entire setup who would give the interesting kind of news every now and then. So what happens in the development sector, what happens, say, in the education sector or the health sector beyond the bad news, interests some people. So I think the important thing is to actually speak to people who understand the issue involved. I think I saw a slide and what you had put down as to looking at media partners who could actually pick up and write about some of those issues. And I think the truth is that in every state and in every location, we have people in the media who pick up the better stories and pick up efforts which are being made, some of which work, some of which don't work, and understand it in the true spirit in which it is intended. So the idea is to identify those people and sort of push forward. In these sectors, in each of these sectors, I think the other good thing is that the bad news emerges as something which is a collective responsibility of a long period of neglect or a long period of something not having been done effectively. So to that extent, the edge gets taken off. Especially in states like Tamil Nadu, where it's a very competitive political system between two major political forces, when it's a long period of problem and both are responsible, then it doesn't make news. So that way it kind of helps out if one or two of those kind of issues come up. But then I think the other thing about politics, and here I wouldn't like to say, he did mention elected representatives and politics, but I think there are some positive things that come out of it. And when you look at, again, from my own state, it's in some ways so hyper-competitive that both of them are looking to do. Constantly the political competition is who can outdo the other in a particular thing, who can outdo the other in attracting more investment, who can outdo the other in implementing development programs better. And I think when we do stuff like this, link it to evidence, and some of it can even go into, I remember having a conversation with some of friends from JPAL, and I think Iqbal was also there, and probably Aparna was there, saying that some of the people we need to talk to are actually, you need to talk to major political parties and states and tell them some of the ideas that could come out of it. My first idea when they came up, the latest study we have taken up is something called the sleep study in Chennai amongst the urban poor, and the kind of things they want to give away, a comfortable bed, a table fan, and various other things which would help people sleep better. I said, you've given me a wonderful set of ideas to put into the next manifesto or the next list of things that people want to give away. But jokes apart, in a fairly serious way, I think when there is political competition of this nature going on, if you are able to feed evidence-based ideas which could make a serious impact, I think we've done a good job. I think we've sort of helped all sides to reach a kind of a better solution than we would have reached otherwise.
I was hoping you would say that, and I think last questions for, similar questions for both of you. Madhav, first, we've been working together for many, many years, and you always stimulate us. So what should we do next? What's interesting from your point of view? What's the thing that you want us to do next? You've always led us. We've always found new terrains because of things you thought of.
Interesting. Well, actually, first question is what should I do next? I've been struggling with that for the last 2 years, ever since I stepped down. I think there's so much change out there that you've got to do something radically and dramatically different. It bothers me, let's say, just talk about education, there could be other things as well. It bothers me that 70% of the students, no matter what else is happening, 70% of the students who join Standard 1 will not go beyond 10th standard. And these people will become a part of, they'll be adults, and then they'll be doing things. And their learning is, what is their learning? I mean, if we measure the learning only for reading, writing, arithmetic, then it becomes more or less flat. But after a certain, we are in the middle of, not middle of, we've just concluded a survey of 14 to 18-year-olds. Vilma is sitting here, I don't want to steal her thunder, but basically there are no surprises. So my question to myself is, are we measuring the right thing? Do people learn or not? And in this changing world, should that be the only thing we should be measuring? I'll give you an example. We are running a program with tablets. You already know it, but let me enlighten the audience on this. And the tablets were preloaded with science, math, and English, and so on and so forth, for the children to learn by themselves in groups and so on, which was nice. And I, for the first time, and we had this conversation, I said, I don't want to say what the children are going to learn. I want to see what happens when you give the tablets. And as it happened, when we gave the tablets, the person who was leading our software group, she said, you know, when we give the tablets, we should make sure that they're safe and the children should not be putting in all kinds of other games and videos into it. So let's put some passwords in it so that the children will not be able to do all these things. I said, sure, go ahead if that's what you think will work. And within 15 days of the tablets being distributed, the tablets were distributed in 400 villages, and the total number of tablets was about 3,000 or so. Given in villages for the families to keep, and then they could be shared with groups of children. What we found was within 15 days, all the passwords were broken. Not that children themselves knew how to do it, but the word spread so fast that you can actually, and was there a purpose to it? There wasn't really. It was like playing a prank, and they said, see, we can do better than you. Now, this learning is precious. When we started this, I was thinking the children could learn a bit of science. Maybe I'll find out whether they will learn English. But we found that most children in the groups were doing videos. They were recording videos, and we had not planned on that. Now, I don't know whether I should be measuring science learning and English learning, or whether I should be looking at the skills they've earned and the things that have triggered because I'm handing them a technology that's precious and that they don't get. And then, so how do you measure the unexpected? That's
excellent question.
So I think that would be a very interesting question to look at. Or let's say, forget about giving them tablets. It is true, in a state like Punjab, every household has 2 or 3 smartphones, apparently. Or at least that's what we are asking, and that's the feedback that I'm getting. In a state like Tamil Nadu, 88% households have color TV. Now, how does this impact their learning, the messages they get? We may say that children are not able to read, but there could be some other things that are going. Human brain is not going to just sit idle. So what are children learning? I think we have to turn the question around and say, what are they learning? And there are things that we've not even looked at. And the society is incredibly complex. It already is, and it's going to get even worse, or well, better, whichever way you look at it. The pressures on children about things that they have to learn or not learn, or agree or not agree with, what about those things? We have not even looked at those. We're just looking at reading, writing. And come on now, 16-year-old person, you're testing reading, writing, that's what we do. That's not fair. You should be asking them interesting questions about their love life. Not that they will answer you, but the amount of experimentation that's going on in the society is incredible. I mean, we grew up in a very, very quiet society comparatively, I would think. And now hormones are running wild. Now, what about that? We are not even looking at that. And there's a whole change that we had. There was one survey that was published by the Population Council or something, or at least it was in the news. And they found that 14 to 18-year-olds, some more than 50% said that they'd actually seen a sexual act on their cell phone. And it was not a commercial porn or whatever. Now, all these things are underground and happening, and these are shaping the minds and the society and all that, and we have not done anything about those. So I think this question about what is it that we are not measuring, what is it that we are not even thinking, we are going traditionally by what education is, but children are learning all the time. So the question I ask is, if children are not learning according to Asar and Pratham, then how come they are smarter today? And people keep saying that the children are smarter. So I think that is the question that could be explored. I can go on, but let me stop here.
But you did exactly what I expected, which is say that there's nothing to say and then tell us something really incredible, as always. So JPAL project on porn is coming up in the meanwhile. I thought I said the same question, which is what would you like us to do?
I think just taking off from where Mr. Madhav Chavan left off, which is that, this whole issue of we are so obsessed with governments and with everybody in terms of budgets and how much money gets spent on something and is the money getting spent effectively. I think the way our society is growing and aggregate expenditure of both the central and the state government has been about 32% of our GDP for a long, long time. And given where our tax GDP ratios stand and given the kind of restrictions on borrowing, I don't see it going up significantly in the near future. But there are many, many segments of society, segments of the economy which are flourishing without government having to spend money directly, but can be influenced in various ways. And that's this whole notion of, how behavioral economics works, or how, what are those little nudges and little pushes that we need to give to different segments, and how various government laws work, how many of them are actually effective, what can be done to, where is it worth actually getting in and interfering, and where do you just step back and allow the forces which are acting both in society and economy to take over and allow things to go forward. I think there's a big area there to actually look at, which we are not seriously examining or looking at. Within governments, most of it then comes down to money. And if there is a problem, then the solution is also to throw more money at it, even if that is really not the solution, because that's the easiest thing to do. The easiest thing to say is that I will increase the budgetary allocation, or I will sort of spend a little more, or create a cess, or do any such mechanism, rather than to look at what are the problems within that, or why is it that a particular issue of this nature is being created. Actually, my move from my previous responsibility to the present responsibility really sets me thinking on the kind of incentives that our regulatory structure sometimes provides, or disincentives that it provides, and it dictates behavior. So there are huge areas where I think that needs to be explored, that needs to be talked about. So there's a lot of exciting work that needs to go into all of those areas. There is some work that JPAL has done for us in the past, at least information they've provided, which have influenced the way we've made policy on fairly sensitive issues. I don't want to mention it, the specific areas, but certainly I think a lot of information and evidence in those areas really needs to guide the way that governments act. The second part of it is that I do understand that collecting data and doing all those studies are long-winded exercises, difficult exercises, but the problem is policymakers are always on a short fuse. We need to turn things around much faster than researchers can come back to us. Now, are there some shortcuts? Are there ways where we can actually try and meet some of these challenges? One big challenge is we collect a lot of data. When you were speaking, you made this point about the quality of the data and how you have specialized so much in data collection now that you're able to get good quality data out quickly. So the capacity building for agencies, more people being able to collect the data, and also when governments collect, and already thanks to automation of many processes, we have large volumes of data, and what that data can tell us, and across the board in terms of counterintuitively what can be sort of done, whether it's done within JPAL or whether it's done elsewhere. And again, it needs to be looked at from a more comprehensive, rather than just that department or that particular agency in government, because we have this big problem of verticals and big problem of silos. So whether we can overcome some of that and look at it across government, I think these are the 2 or 3 issues I would like to seriously look at and see where that takes us.
Fabulous. Yeah, of course.
Just something that occurred when we were, this has been going on now, jobs, and a lot of people are sort of coming to the conclusion that there are not going to be enough jobs that will meet the expectations and aspirations of the young people. And the question is, what kind of jobs are going to be there out there? I mean, and how do people see it? I mean, it's out there and young people know that there are no jobs. And it's coming out as reservations or something or the other. And that's on the one side. And there's something very interesting happening on the other. I was in a village in Haryana recently. Educationally, I'm sure it's exactly like all other villages. But in this village, they have a girls' football team. And they started some 10, 11 years ago. And those girls have gone and won the Sugato Cup. And it's only that village. We are not talking about the block or anything. Twice. And once the girls started playing, now there are 300 boys and girls training, and the government has provided a coach, and the villagers have made sure that the girls have another big ground. So you walk into the village, you see girls on bicycles wearing t-shirts, which are like soccer t-shirts, and there are buffaloes on one side. And yet, this is growing, and they're smart, and this is Haryana, by the way. So, and there are many villages that seem to be like this. And has this gone to other villages? No. There's something in this village that has happened. There are apparently villages where chess has become a madness. How does this happen? And why is this happening? And it's going to break out. Sports and athletics will pick up. The Ministry of Sports is likely to become the most important ministry in the future, and probably better than or more important than education. Who would have thought that you would have a commercial program on television on kabaddi? They are going to start competing. I mean, next international wedding will be a kabaddi player somewhere, in Brazil or something like that. That's likely to happen. These changes are big social changes, I'm sure, are happening at the grassroots. And these are not promoted by any social workers or NGOs. There's something completely dramatically different that's happening at the grassroots, which we don't have a clue about. We are stuck in what was happening when we grew up. We are motivated by what we learned 40 years ago and what we did 20 years ago. And I put Pratham in that as well. We are still stuck in the 20-year-old agenda. And how is that agenda changing on the ground? How are people changing that is something that is going to be of immense interest. We have to see that.
Amen. Okay, I'm going to take a few questions. I think we have a few minutes. Okay. Go ahead.
Social and behavior change. And Shobni and I have been discussing this a little bit, and I think it takes off, Mr. Krishnan, from what you said about what you'd like to see next happen. I don't see as much rigorous evidence in one area, which is communication for behavior change. There are big budgets associated both at the central and the state government level, as well as I think what you said, Mr. Chavan, about different media, TV, community theater, other things where people are learning, they are getting messages. You talked in the context of education, but it could be in the context of any behavior change you want. So I guess the question to the panelists is, do you see that as an area where we can bring in some of this kind of evidence that you've been working on, either to optimize IEC, IPC budgets, but more generally to use that as a lever for behavior change when we've got all these programs running?
I mean, two things which we are trying to do. I agree with you that there's a lot happening on the communication side which we don't entirely understand, and in the way that people communicate, particularly on social media and so on. But two things that we are consciously trying to do and trying to link it to behavior. One is an RCT which is just started up in Tamil Nadu, which is on the exclusive breastfeeding RCT, which is mostly using an IEC tool to communicate a message and see how it works. And I think that is going to get controlled, and then probably we'll understand better as to how a communication strategy actually works. The other one is something that a department of the government of Tamil Nadu came up with, which is the social welfare department, trying to look at, what is it that they need to do with, better gender outcomes in terms of women understanding what the provisions of the domestic violence bill are and a whole host of other areas are. And that's entirely a communication strategy, and where they want to do, again, a baseline and an end line, and do it in an evaluated way in order to understand how effective that communication strategy has been. And there, it's again looking at multiple medias. What are all the various media going into? I agree that our communication, there are some communication strategies which are very successful, which work in very interesting ways, and there are others which just don't end up doing much. It's too soft an area for people to really understand and realize, and most of our publicity budgets get eaten up with advertisements and print ads and a variety of things. But yes, there's a lot of leverage which is possible there, and hopefully these two little experiments we are trying to do will give us some understanding of some things which can work, and so that we can refine the communication strategy better. Thanks.
Thank you.
Since it's 10 years of DPAD, but I'll ask you a reflective question. I think one of the really interesting things that have happened in these last 10 years, the RCTs, ASAR, and a whole host of other things, is that the sort of knowledge function of what the state used to do, the state producing knowledge about itself and placing it in the public domain, has transformed, because a lot of knowledge is now being produced outside of the state in some ways to feed back into the state, right? So in some senses, the state has become a lot more transparent, and that brings perhaps a whole host of different kinds of pulls and pressures. And I was curious to hear from all of you about what that's done from your experiences to the actual art of statecraft. And I don't mean policy impact, because we all get very obsessed with policy impact. That's what our funders ask us. We have to find nice stories. I mean more about just the role of the state per se, and how the state goes about taking decisions now that the effects of what the state does is actually a story that is not told by the state to people when you come out to look for, 5 years later asking for votes. It's information that is constantly being churned out in different ways and through different modalities in the public domain. So just on this panel, right, you've got highly sophisticated RCTs, you've got equally sophisticated ASARs, but if you're not a really sophisticated economist, you might get the ASAR number much more easily than you could get the RCT number, but yet they both are playing a really important role outside of the state, engaging with the state. So what is that doing for decision-making within the state?
She spoke so fast, I can't understand. Maybe if you answer, I'll figure it out.
I guess we already had a little bit of a conversation on this point. I mean, I feel that, let me little bit say something maybe a little bit provocative, just because I think mostly I agree with what has already been said, but I feel that there's a danger of too much transparency. And the danger is that there is I think there's a sense in which, again, there's a difference between providing reliable and balanced evidence and finding scapegoats. And I think it's not clear to me that a transparency without some broad culture of discussion and debate, which we don't really have. We have a culture of browbeating in general, is necessarily an obvious plus, because I think in some ways it's just, I use the evidence I want to use to browbeat you. If you look at what's right? Happened on demonetization. There was just a series of, of essentially, the media would say, these are the numbers, and then there would be some other, the question would be shifted all the time. So it's not clear to me that till there is a culture where we are skeptical enough about what is claimed to be evidence. I think it's not clear to me that transparency per se, because it's a sense of plenty. I can pick up a number, you can pick up a number. I can make up something, you can make up something. It's not clear whether, I think we're going very much in a he said, she said direction, which is the US. This is like the archetypal example where it's a complete disaster. Nobody believes anything anymore that comes from the other side. I'm a bit worried about that possibility, that in a sense the free use of information and possibly unregulated and unreliable use of information, I think creates a culture within which it's actually quite hard to know what's real.
I think definitely one thing that you say is true, that there are a number of interlocutors who speak to the state on much more equal terms than used to happen earlier. And it's not just aid agencies and so on. And one thought that I had was that, when we engage with, say, an agency like JPAL, and we do it with other organizations also, it's not an exclusive sort of arrangement with JPAL, other entities we engage with. The one thing which is happening is it's a bit of a force multiplier. The kind of people the kind of brains, the kind of human resource that we are able to get into this whole issue of addressing a set of issues without them necessarily being part of the government or, taken on board in some think tank, organization of government or some department of government, has really helped in actually looking at issues in a more holistic way, and that's certainly helped in the way quality of decision-making in government has gone up. And I think, at least in the case of Tamil Nadu, one of the things that we explicitly recognized early on was that we wanted to sort of look at the state itself going into a knowledge economy kind of situation. And straight away, when you have so many people who are producing knowledge and content and output, then there are challenges. And I think we have gotten so used to being questioned by everybody. I mean, the number of people who question government, the easiest thing to do is to question government, whether it's the CNAG or whether it is the courts or whether it is the media or whether it is any research institution. And I think that is something which we engage with. It does take time, in the sense that a lot of creative energy and effort gets spent on, say, replying to the Auditor General or replying to the courts, or even, attending to what the media has to say. But I think it also improves over time the quality of decision making. Once bitten, twice shy. You don't make the same mistake again. You try and do it a little better the next time when it's an issue which has come up before the court. So a lot of ways in that. I mean, you learn by making some of those mistakes, and the state also learns. There's another little debate which informs this, and I think that's the point that Abhijit made in terms of how do you look at the advice that you get. And I was part of this big debate within the IMF at some point when they wanted to publicize the article for mission reports. And there was a strong opposition from certain countries within the IMF setup who said, no, the IMF is a confidential advisor. The quality of advice that the IMF would be able to give would be a lot worse if it came out that tomorrow it's going to be in the press. And so there was this big argument, very similar to this point being made, that if you are a confidential advisor, then you have greater freedom in giving giving far more, how do I put it, unfavorable advice or difficult things to do, advising on those kind of issues. On the other hand, if it's going to be publicized immediately, then you would probably pull back punches. So there's always this trade-off, and we need to think about those kind of issues. So the engagements and the manner in which the government engages also is also determined by that factor. Though eventually, I think, at least in the Indian context, thanks to RTI and thanks to so many other things, it's not possible to withhold a lot of this for very long. And therefore, we need to see, it certainly affects the way we do business within government in terms of what actually gets recorded on file and the manner in which a conversation goes. So you but you also think about those decisions a lot more carefully. And I think that's a good thing, because in policy making, a little time lost to thinking through decisions better is not such a bad thing.
Last question.
I feel that sometimes you would have also felt frustrated that the pace at which you would like to do your studies and the adoption of the recommendations by the governments to sort of improve upon the way they are functioning. So what are the other alternative strategies you are working for improving the incomes or livelihood of the people, such as things like people-to-people learning and reducing dependence on the government? Because government system is very slow moving and very ineffective at times. But surely there would be other methods also by which people can be helped instead of waiting for the government to reform itself. So are there any alternative strategies which you feel can be worked out to improve the livelihoods of the people?
I think that's an excellent question. It's sort of a good question to end on, because it's, I think it sort of points to something we need to take forward, which is, I think that one way in which, I think there are many things you said, and I'm not going to deal with all of them. One way in which we, I think, need to engage better is to engage with not just governments, but the entire political system. Because this, as Mr. Krishnan says, it's a political competition that generates outcomes. So we're a little bit maybe too focused on governments, in a sense. We don't engage with other players who in principle can be, the next manifesto can be what we try to influence. And those things we don't do as much. In some ways we want to engage with with a bunch of players trying to suggest that, maybe you should push this because this is actually something that, you can back up with evidence. So I think that it's a direction we haven't thought very much about. It's not so far from what we do, but I think it is a little bit a direction we need to take more.